Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. I'm in the midst of a journey, and I'm just going to share with you where it started, where it's going, where I am, and how it might have some insights and implications for all of us. So let's start with fighting the good fight. Where do I start with all this? Well, I start actually in childhood. I was one of the lucky ones to grow up in a family which took part in India's freedom struggle. So very early on, I had the opportunity to have inspiration from people like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, not as figures that were far away, but as figures that were meaningful to me in my own life, partly because my father and uncle were in the freedom struggle. They told me about their exciting adventures during that very exciting time. And my uncle went on to serve in Nehru's cabinet in New Delhi. Then, of course, as I grew up and continued to reinforce my desire to get out there and do something in the world of politics and public service, there were leaders elsewhere who continued to inspire me to go out there and continue to fight the good fight. But how? This is the big challenge. The independence movement is over. And here we are in a nation that's building up, and everyone around me is focusing on a different career. No one is thinking about a career in the world of politics. So I said, well, let me also focus on how the world is changing and prepare to gain some expertise in public policy, because it's not anymore about agitating. It's probably about governing, about leading. And so I went out to the US and got myself a PhD in public policy and management from the Wharton School. And it was a fantastic experience. It's tough to get into Wharton. It's even tougher to get out of Wharton with a degree. And really, they sort of push you to achieve your potential and then some more. Anyway, it was fantastic. It was a great experience in American higher education. And I went on to do a postdoc at Berkeley. I was a professor at Oklahoma. And then I thought back to myself and said, what was the purpose of all this? To work on Indian public policy. And I've been doing so much work on American public policy. Well, it's time to go home. And essentially, a year after I was promoted and tenured, I turned in my papers and moved back to Bangalore, my hometown, to be at the Indian Institute of Management, where I have been ever since. Well, once I returned, things were quite exciting. My father was the Speaker of the Assembly, and he introduced me to Sonia Gandhi and Dr. Manmohan Singh. They were in the opposition at that time. And they were really excited to find someone from a Congress family with world-class credentials and a passion for politics. And they welcomed me with open arms. They invited me to a brainstorming session of the party in Shimla. And in 2004, as the run-up to the general election took place, I was in the short list of people who were going to run for parliament. I was chosen to launch a next-generation election campaign around Rahul Gandhi's entry into the party. Things are going beautifully. Unfortunately, there's a catch. The night before the nomination was fixed, I was nixed, and somebody else, a very successful real estate entrepreneur, was given the nomination in my place. Okay, why? The world had changed, right? It was no longer about coming from a freedom movement or having credentials. It was about how much you could spend. What kind of, not just how much you could spend, but given India's very messed up election expenditure rules, how much underground money, black money you could spend. Because essentially, there are some very odd and very farcical limits. So most of the money gets spent, without being open about it. And so elections cost money. It's a reality that we have to face. And there was this conundrum. The people might want someone like me. The political class says, not viable. Why? This is a quote. He and his family have not made money. How can you give him a nomination? Yeah? That's the sort of thing. So in this sort of a situation, where the political world is filled with crooks and criminals and those who have illegal resources, what do you do? Okay, well, it's time for a poll. Okay, so what do we do? Let's choose. Should I give up and say politics is not for decent people? A lot of Indians have done that. Should I say, okay, I have a good cause, so let me make the necessary compromises? Should I turn entrepreneur, become rich, and then come back to politics? Sounds viable. Or should I switch to an advisory role? After all, that would still give me a chance to have an impact on policy. Or should I say, let's use my smarts to outsmart, those who are coming in the way? What do you think? Poll on. Can I have the results? All right. Excellent. Okay, so we'll figure out how to beat, come up with a way to beat the establishment. All right? So let's continue with the story. And there's a very wonderful quotation from Teddy Roosevelt where he says, go out there and plunge into the political world, into the electoral arena, because he says the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, etc. You get the drift. Right? But it's not easy. Multiple factors come into play. One is the resources needed. But the world is changing, and there are people now who are willing to openly back good political candidates. Wonderful. So it's worth staying the course. The challenge is the educated voter. I'm planning to run from Bangalore city, and we have a large number of educated Indians here. And the catch is that they're very good at sitting in their armchairs and criticizing, pontificating, but they don't show up at the polling booth. So what do we do? Forget getting resources and ideas and energy from them, right? So that's the challenge. Well, they too can be mobilized if we figure out how. The life, that's a bigger challenge because you have to balance a career, multiple careers in a family, and it's incredibly difficult to do all that. And then, of course, there's the challenge of the platform. The platform really is, what do you bring to the table? Why should anyone care for you and vote you, right? And of course, the challenge is also about the person itself. What am I good at? Am I an agitator? Am I a schemer? Am I a manipulator? Am I an inspirer? I don't know. We'll figure this out, right? Okay, so that sort of thing. Okay, so I set up an NGO called Resurgent India, and we focused on India's large youth population. We worked on a variety of career-related events. That's going very well. And I've had the pleasure of mentoring a youngster who set up her own organization, which is really doing a wonderful job in a space similar to one of our speakers here today from Make a Difference. So that's another thing that's happening. And then, out of the blue, we had an incident in a neighboring city called Bangalore, where a bunch of right-wing thugs basically said that they were going to teach people how to behave. They attacked a bunch of young women in a pub and said, good girls should not be in pubs. And not only did they attack them, they actually filmed the whole attack and then turned over the film to the television studios. And they didn't stop there. They said, in a few days, we're going to have Valentine's Day, and we think Bangalore city is becoming the den of corruption. On Valentine's Day, they're going to come to Bangalore city, and if they find any couples holding hands, they're going to either get them married off or they're going to make them exchange Rakis. Okay? So that was the sort of situation. And everywhere I went, I ran into youngsters saying, what's happening to our cosmopolitan city? Everyone was fearful. But the usual suspects didn't really stand up and do anything about this. So I sat with a bunch of my young friends and said, come on, let's do something. Let's express our opposition to this kind of attacks on women, on the attacks on our freedoms. And so I went to the media and said, I'm going to organize protest rallies across Bangalore city, used the internet to also get the word out, email and other things, and essentially came up with what I consider an innovative protest design. In Bangalore city, if you say, even for a very significant cause, come to the center of town, to Mahatma Gandhi statue, and fight for a cause together, you'll get about 25 people who show up. Even if 250,000 people care for that issue, right? So I said, it's time to take the protest to the people, to where they are. And that's what we did. On a working day, at lunchtime, 25 simultaneous rallies across the city. Luckily, since I keep going to colleges and giving talks, various principals with one phone call said, okay, we'll send all our students out. Those sort of things. That's the kind of cooperation I got. And at the bottom, we have a protest that was organized in an information technology park, a very sterile, apolitical environment. That's the kind of anger that people had at that very moment. And at the same time, there was one more innovative protest that emerged on a newly emerging Facebook, something called the Pink Chaddi campaign, where a bunch of young women basically decided that they would express their disgust by sending pink lingerie to the attackers. Okay, so this is a picture where they're saying, like, what do we do with this? Anyway, it is like, very, very innovative stuff that was going on at the same time. Anyway, once we did these protests, okay, we ended up in a situation where they walked away, they did not take on the fight, and basically we succeeded in having an impact. More than the specific cause, the key issue is that we mobilize people politically. Most people in Bangalore had forgotten that they had the strength to stand up and raise their voices, raise their arms in protest, right? And we managed to get that change going. Okay. Well, so as I think about how we can make an impact, how I can change the rules of the game, etc., I think about how the media came in very, very useful, and about how the media now has morphed into social media and newer methods of connecting one-on-one, of keeping continuously engaged, and having a dialogue, all these sorts of things. So basically, I'm using these platforms as a way to level the playing field, to outsmart the establishment, and it's working out nicely. The Congress Party has now appointed me as one of their national spokespersons. So while you're in India over the next few days, if you turn on TV at about 8 or 9 at night, you might see me having one of those heated arguments that David talked about. Anyway, we've got to continue to change the game. We've got to figure out how we can connect with people, mobilize youth, inspire people, and really change the nature of the political process within India. And what do these little experiences mean for the rest of us, right? I would argue that every one of us should do something that improves the world. And you might say, why should we? And my immediate response is, because we can, right? In some sense, there's an imperative. If you have the capacity to do something, we should. In fact, we must, because there are lots of challenges in this world that need addressing. And it's not just that we're talking about politics in a mature democracy like ours. Everywhere around us, we're seeing youngsters standing out there at the forefront of protests. The Arab Spring is an example. You've seen similar movements in Occupy Wall Street. I'm not suggesting that you engage with the ideology. I'm just pointing out that you should have the courage to stand up and do something. And in India, we had a massive anti-corruption movement that shook the establishment and is still, the repercussions are still something that we're looking at. Anyway, as we think about this, there's another reason why it makes sense. You might know the philosopher Hannah Arendt. She argues that there are actually 3 dimensions which make a human fully human. And one is family life, another is work life, and the third she calls viva activa, public life, working together with others in public spheres to create social capital. Okay? And so if we leave that side out, we're missing out on something, right? Okay. And if you don't want to go out there and enter politics or make a difference in any way that gets you personal credit, etc., you could do things anonymously. In Bangalore city, we have a very interesting group called the Ugly Indian. And they are a group of people who do not take credit for anything that they do. They do not, nobody knows who they are. I do, but nobody knows who they are. And essentially, they go out there and fix, what they call black spots. Okay? And, there's a potential poll out there, but I will skip that. This is what a street looked like at 8 a.m., and then they went and indulged in a bit of spot fixing and made a permanent solution to that particular neighborhood. So every one of us, in our own way, can make a difference to our communities, and that's the real issue. See, many times when I go out there and engage with young audiences and tell them, look, we've got to do something. We have the capacity. People tell me, look, why would we? And I say, look, youngsters like you, who are educated, were at the freedom movement's forefront, 60 years ago. Why aren't you doing something? And their immediate glib response is, there are no freedom movements today. Well, you might have heard of this gentleman, Amartya Sen, and his book, Development is Freedom, right? He's India's Nobel laureate in economics. Well, Sen has a very different concept of freedom. He says true freedom is when each and every individual can live up to his or her potential. And when you look at it from that point of view, he says, you need to be free of poverty, to be free of illiteracy, to be free of ill health. Because if you're poor, you're focusing on sustenance and survival. You can't do much more. If you're unwell, you can't do much anyway. And if you're illiterate, you can't engage with the world of ideas, you can't grow. And that leads me to ask everyone, so we're not free of poverty, we're not free of ill health, we're not free of illiteracy, then there are many freedom movements waiting for us to fight. Let's get out there and do that. And when we do that, let's remember the words of one of India's great spiritual leaders, Swami Vivekananda. He said, so long as the millions live in poverty and ignorance, I hold every man a traitor who, having been educated at their expense, pays not the least heed to them. Each and every one of us have our opportunities because someone somewhere is missing out on them thanks to some government, whatever, right? Each of us has that obligation to reach out and fight the good fight to make a difference. Thank you.